The tradition of patchwork was started in England, and then it was taken to America and developed a lot, lots of traditional American patterns. Those I find most inspiring, and I find lots of old books of patchwork quilts, sort of how-to books, and started making traditional quilts really from the beginning. It was after seeing some of the quilts in the American Museum in Bath, and there was a particular quilt there called the Widow's Quilt, which is just in black and white fabric. That I just loved the sort of starkness of that image, and so I made this traditional maple leaf, and then from then on I made a large traditional quilt, and then I started designing my own images.
I suppose the hardest thing is to actually make a living from your work. I mean, I felt that I was determined to do that right from the beginning. Quilts are big things, so you basically need a fairly big space to work in. The interest of quilt making has exploded, but the majority of people are still very much wanting to know about traditional works. In the States, from about 1972, there was quite a few books published, and yet over here in England we just didn't have anything really. So people ordered these books, so we were looking at basically American publications, magazines, books, all sorts of things that influenced the quilt makers here in England. In America, Michael James is probably the best example. He's emphasising the design of quilt making and contemporary work, and the later editions of American books are talking just about the art quilt. The Seasons is a quilt by Michael James, commissioned by a bank in Boston. It's a bit like a landscape, the upper part reflecting the sky and the lower part the ground, trees and water. The composition reflects the seasonal changes in New England, showing the dark winter colours on the left, moving through spring to the heat of summer and into the rich rusts and browns of the autumn. It is all hand quilted and measures approximately 15 foot by 5 foot. It took over 7 months to complete. It was also so nice to know that someone was working in a very professional way. They were there making a living from it, and I was half making a living and half trying to scrape pennies together. But it was like I could aim towards it. You know, if I knew there was someone else out there making a living from it, it was possible. So that meant an awful lot to me at that time. I mean, what we have to do is to present our work to professional galleries and get them to accept these works as artworks. We need our work to be taken seriously, and so we don't want to put our work in anything less than good art galleries. In America, the art quilt has really split now, and so the art quilt is being taken up by professional galleries, and it's being shown for its own sake. Michael James has just had a one-person exhibition to show his new body of work, which was held in the Wheeler Gallery in Providence.
Michael has really influenced thousands of people in the many workshops that he's done throughout the States and on several visits over here in England. And I think everyone's found him a great inspiration.
Thank you. As recently as 15 years ago, the idea that a quilt could be art, or that an artist would make quilts, was completely unknown. Although even now the majority of people interested in quilts focus on the traditional aspect of quilt making. The innovation, the exploratory side of quilt making is continually expanding and growing, and I think augurs well for the future of quilts as an art form. My own orientation to quilt making was quite traditional. Although I have a background as an artist, although I studied painting and printmaking, I came to quilt making from a very traditional standpoint, and only after a number of years did my work eventually move away from the tradition and begin to explore new directions. At the same time, my teaching of quilt making reflected the same pattern and the same sort of progression. I began teaching very traditional quilt making techniques and processes and focused on traditional quilt design, and then gradually moved away toward the areas of design and color. I had become familiar enough with what I call or think of as the quilt world to begin to realize that one of the things that seemed to be, at least to me, absent from that world was an understanding of design language. So I evolved a series of courses that I teach on an irregular basis that deal with the language of design and concepts of color and design, the fundamentals of these areas. The process of learning that language involves the experience of different concepts, rhythm, color, pattern, balance, symmetry, asymmetry, space, interval, etc., which taken individually amount to not much more than tiny little stretching exercises for the mind, but taken collectively provide the basis for becoming familiar with that language that I mentioned, and provide an ability to employ that language in one's work. And I sense in the quilt world a general desire among quilt makers to get hold of that language and apply it to the things that they do. And I think that particularly suggests that this form will continue to grow beyond the traditional and explore new areas that none of us at this point can yet imagine.
I went to Michael James' masterclass about 7 years ago, I think it is now. At that time, I'd only just got into quilts. I don't like traditional painting so much as abstract painting, so his work was kind of what I liked. You've got to play with not only the designing part, you've got to play with the fabrics as well, so that they interrelate, that what the fabric says to you. You've got to listen to the fabric talking to you to know what to do next.
And I've always believed that
by the language of design, I think he meant that instead of using words, we're using colour, tone and shape as our language. I mean, the rhythm comes in these sort of flowing shapes that are on this quilt, Red Singer. The depth really comes into it with the tonal value. Quite often darker fabrics sort of go more towards the background. If you have pale fabrics coming over the top of them, it's going to look as if it's in the foreground more. But he's also moved away from having the square or rectangle as his outer edge of the quilt, because I mean it looks as if some of these shapes are curling over the back of the quilt. In fact, it's an illusion that they're doing that.
While on this visit to Great Britain, I was particularly interested in seeing the work of the new generation of fiber artists who might indicate the possible evolution of quilt making in the next 20 years. And a few weeks ago, I was introduced to Faye Collins, Heather Roweth, and Ilanid Edwards, young art students or recent graduates whose work I found to be incredibly exciting. We'll start with Faye, whose piece is hanging just behind us. Is this a typical representation of what you've been up to recently?
Yes, it is. I've been working in this way, very formal, geometric, and but I've tried to keep it very simple at the same time.
Right.
The original subject matter was sort of fencing, coloured fencing, and the shadows that were cast on the constructions. That's what interested me. So, I mean, really, it's got a lot of depth.
Is all of the fabric in this dyed fabric?
Yeah, it's all hand dyed.
Let's go on to Heather now. Do you want to give us some clue as to what you were working toward in that piece?
Well, the piece came from drawings of just 3 objects. There was the little wooden zebra that goes around the middle, a baby shoe, and the little plane. I used old fabrics. I always use old fabrics, or if I do use new ones, I treat them by either browning them or dyeing them in some way.
It does have the look of something that might already be 25 or 30 years old. That's the result of the dyeing that you...
Yeah, and
tea dyeing.
Baking in ovens.
And baking in ovens, and it's so you've distressed the fabric to create this impression. What about this one here?
That's just been through several aging processes. That was how I was trying to make something look old.
Yeah, it definitely looks like something that's been lying about bric-a-brac dealer's shop for many years. It's probably the most distressed piece that you've got here. It's got a really ancient feeling. In terms of an interest in the past and in one's personal history, I think your work probably comes closest to the sort of orientation that many traditional quilt makers take to their work. Many of the quilts of the 19th century really amount to personal historical records, and in a sense that's really what...
Yeah, that's important to me, that the object will go on after I'm gone and be an heirloom. It's got to have that sort of quality with it.
We'll go to Ilinid and talk a bit about process. This is a leather construction.
Yeah, I've sort of endeavoured to transmit the rawness of the location I was in, which was the Liverpool docks, but also just to try and generate the atmosphere of what I saw there and also what I felt. So
there is a sense of decay, of aging. You're obviously drawn to pattern because these photographs record pattern in incredible variation, and it translates into these pieces quite beautifully.
Yeah, I like the idea, which I suppose stems from traditional quilting, of laminating textures and colours. I think it gives you a tremendous scope for bringing a lot of elements together.
A question that I know viewers of this program will raise is that they'll look at all of this work and they'll say, but those aren't quilts. Those aren't real quilts.
Well, they're quilts because we say they are.
Right.
But obviously we all work with an awareness. Well, to me it's obvious that we all work with an awareness of traditional quilting. It's part of our artistic vocabulary.
I found the work of the 3 students very interesting and stimulating. I found the patchwork banner very, very interesting. The more I looked at it, the more I could see in it. And I found the quilted memory pieces were very interesting as well. In some ways closer to more traditional work, the use of the quilting. I think it shows that we've got to carry on developing the craft and that there are a lot of new ideas that are coming forward. One of the things I've been doing is I've been using a home computer to design quilts. I've done a lot with traditional designs, but I found distorting the block so that you're really using a different grid form has become very interesting and a very challenging, interesting way of using things.
One of the things that is most important to any artist is change and development. I think that any artist worth his or her medal is one who is an explorer and who seeks out new avenues and forces the evolution of his or her work. Over the years, I've had the good fortune of knowing the work of Pauline Burbage, Lucy Goffin, and Michelle Walker, and seeing the development that their work has progressed through. And today we're going to have the opportunity to talk to them about some of that recent development. Pauline, I've been fascinated by particularly by the new style of quilting that's going into your work. You had a wonderful opportunity in the last year to work with an industrial quilting
machine
company. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, the opportunity came via something called a project that Nottingham Castle ran called Artists in Industry, and they put various artists in different industrial places. Well, I actually chose to go and work in a quilting factory. The first week I just learned actually how to use this multi-needle quilting machine, and the second week I could actually put some samples through of my work. Now, at the same time that was going on, my imagery of the quilts that I make also was in turmoil, and I was doing a lot of work just with torn paper collage, actually, getting right away from actually making quilts for that period of time. It was an attempt to really loosen up the imagery. For a 5-year period before all this work was going on, I was working in very hard-edged, three-dimensional type of geometric pattern.
Right,
which
I'm familiar with all of that work.
A piece like this one, I mean, I guess I'm still clinging to the idea of the traditional quilt, because the thing that is clinging to that tradition, I suppose, is working in repeated blocks.
Right. Right.
So I'm going back to working, here I've got 9 repeated blocks. In fact, in this one, I mean, all the shapes are absolutely identical, but what I've done is change the stitching diagonally across the quilts to try and get some much more freedom in the stitching. This was actually the beginning of all this collage work.
This piece?
Yeah, and I was like, you know how you are, you're frightened to change, to become more fluid. In ones that came afterwards, like this piece behind me, I was working in a much more fluid way, no templates at all, but just cutting out the fabric in it just as it came, sticking it on with this sort of fabric glue, and that's the way I want to work in the future, in a much more fluid way, and perhaps still working with blocks, but making those blocks grow over the whole piece of work.
Do you think that you'll at any point abandon the grid structure, the modular structure?
I might well do. At the moment, I'm very happy working with it. Yeah.
But in a sense, you really can't do anything before you're ready to do it. And so if you're ever going to abandon the grid, you wait till the time that's right for you to do that. You can't do it prematurely.
Yeah.
Lucy, let's look at some of your new work.
Yes, well, it has changed quite a lot. I wanted to try and work a little more freely with shapes and colour. Before this phase in my work, my work generally was much more geometric. But the thing that is really interesting me very much is perhaps what's beginning to happen in this one, which is called Dancers. I am passionately interested in music and dance. And so in a way that came, this one is very much influenced by that, but also a sense of rhythm.
Yeah.
I felt that...
the textural richness of the stitchery and on top of the color and the movement just gives them vivacity and a sense of kineticism almost that's quite compelling.
Well, it's a beginning.
Now these two appear actual seascape type images, are they not?
Yes, they are a slight departure because I live in a port and I'm beginning to make drawings and to work more directly from boats. And again, the light qualities, because
in the port, which has a tidal river, then one's horizon is constantly changing, both in relation to the way the water is moving with the tide.
Right.
And in fact, these two are about high and low tide. The other thing, and which again I want to work further with, is this. Going back to this question of grids and working within grid. I don't necessarily see myself continuing quite in that way, but one of the reasons why I've worked in this particular way and all these pieces has been a fascination with windows and the idea of looking through a framework to a series of shapes and colours and textures.
Michelle, you also have come from a fairly strict orientation to the grid to a more free-form orientation in your newer work.
Yes, and this quilt was the last of a series of 4 quilts. And after that, I thought I should be much more experimental. And I did a number of little designs on paper. I always start off with paper. I like using and manipulating paper. And it seemed, I liked the idea of folding fabric. It seemed to extend, you know, the quality of fabric much more. And I started by making little pencil drawing stripes on the paper. And I was interested in the way these lines changed when it was pleated. I love those narrow ribbons and the way that they change colour according to how they're lit. And I think that's something I want to explore much more.
I suspect that some people would respond the way they might to the work of Faye and Heather and Ilinid that we saw earlier by saying that these things are no longer quilts.
I don't care about that. I mean, all I want to do is to enjoy what I do. And I mean, people can say whatever, they can put whatever label they want on it.
Well, after all of this eavesdropping that you've done this morning, do any of you have any questions that you'd like to ask?
You seem to use the sewing machine in preference to handwork. Is this a purely artistic decision or the result of commercial pressures?
I don't really see any virtue in hand stitching unless you really enjoy it. I don't think it devalues the work at all.
The speed of it is the important thing, isn't it? The fact that you can use a sewing machine and do work much faster and therefore spend more time working on designing. That seems to be really important, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Surely there's no comparison, though, between hand quilting and machine.
Yes, actually, I was going to bring that point up because I do use quite a lot of hand stitching in some of my work, and have chosen to do so because the qualities are so different, and the qualities of hand stitching have a place in relation to design and texture and qualities that one might want to achieve, which are different from a machine.
Do any of you want to comment on the formation and functioning of the art quilt group here in England?
Quilt art.
Quilt art group.
Well, I guess we sort of felt that it's time for specialisation a bit more. Quilts have been, you know, very popular in the recent revival of them in the last sort of 12 years or so. And there's a big interest, there certainly is. But within that interest, it feels like it's time to specialise, you know. And so we thought that we needed to try and put the contemporary quilt in the public eye more.
Its larger function is as a marketing tool, in a way, as a way of promoting.
Yeah, because I must admit it was probably
for the quilt maker as well, because you know, if one hesitates to say that you actually make quilts, because people have this picture of you at home stitching little wool hexagons.
Right. I don't hesitate at all, because I mean I say I'm a quilt maker, and that's what I want to be. And but quite often the galleries will say, okay, can we put quilted textiles on there? You know, as if it's like as if it's more towards the art. You know, that would be a broader view of things. But I like to say I'm a quilt maker, and that's what I'm trying to promote.
I think in time it will come around to the point where it's widely accepted, and I think at that point we might get together again and rehash new problems. Thank you.
Thank you.